Ken Burns put out a documentary, a 3-part, 6-hour documentary. Each of the parts is 2 hours long on PBS. Now, I just happened to stumble upon it on the first airing. It was kind of like serendipitous on PBS while I was scrolling the TV. It was like at 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and it had just started, and they were repeating it like throughout the night. So I missed like the first, 15 minutes, half hour. Then, it repeated right away. So then after I finished watching it, I caught that beginning 15 minutes or half hour during the next showing. And PBS, to be honest, I never like checked for it. You know what I mean? I just always thought of it as like where as a kid we used to watch like Sesame Street or like Mr. Rogers, I think. And what's his name? Bob Ross, the dude that used to paint with the afro and like stuff like that, like public programming. But from some of the content that they were promoting, like during in between showings, like they have a lot of dope content apparently. And this Hemingway documentary, which I can speak to, was amazing. First and foremost, I learned so much about Hemingway that I never knew, because I didn't know much about him. To be honest, I haven't read Hemingway aside from, which I know is blasphemous as a writer, aside from like excerpts or passages here and there and like quotes of his that have become famous. Two of which are like great quotes that I like. One, which comedian Ari Shaffir has like taped to his laptop, which states, "The first draft of everything is shit," which is a dope reminder to get, especially from someone at that level, and helps you like get out of your own way and do your work. And another quote is, and I'm going to paraphrase it, that the best way to see any city is on a bicycle, which was also dope to hear because I'm into cycling. Speaking of which, these extra COVID pounds that I've put on could definitely use some cycling. but yeah, so I am not knowledgeable about Hemingway and his work. I know he's regarded as one of the greatest of all time. But I also put him like in the Mark Twain category. Like I thought he was a writer from like the 1800s. I don't know why. Like that was like in my mind. And he's not. He died in 1961, which was the first thing I learned that kind of blew my mind. But here is the official synopsis that I'm going to read to you guys. Hemingway, a 3-part, 6-hour documentary film by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, examines the visionary work and the turbulent life of Ernest Hemingway, one of the greatest and most influential writers America has ever produced. Interweaving his eventful biography, a life lived at the ultimately treacherous nexus of art, fame, and celebrity. With carefully selected excerpts from his iconic short stories, novels, and nonfiction, the series reveals the brilliant, ambitious, charismatic, and complicated man behind the myth and the art he created. So like I said, I happened to catch it on PBS on the first night, and the first night they showed part 1 and they repeated it a couple times, and then the second night, same time, they showed part 2, and the night after that, part 3, and I watched them all that way. And they were so good that I went back to watch, and I wanted my wife to see some of it, but they're not available on demand on PBS. I'm not sure like how that works, but you could like get it for like $1.99 or $2.99 or something like that through like Amazon Prime or Amazon Video. And I'll definitely link to what I can in the episode notes to make it easier for you guys to find, but just Google Hemingway documentary or Ken Burns Hemingway and I'm sure you'll find it. But anyway, I love how it was put together first and foremost. Not just the fact that he was a writer and the content of it and how brilliant his writing was that they did share during the documentary, but just how it was shot with a lot of film of him and his family, which I'll get to in a second. Tons of photographs from his childhood, from his teenage years, his 20s, 30s, throughout his entire life, basically. There was voiceover throughout the whole thing, which I love. And what was exceptionally done was how they shared Ernest Hemingway's writing. That was voiced by Jeff Daniels each time. So he had a separate narrator narrating the documentary, and then whenever they would insert a piece of Ernest Hemingway's writing, it would be Jeff Daniels who read it as Hemingway, which was dope. I really like Jeff Daniels, not just from like the Dumb and Dumber days, but his more like serious roles like Newsroom and his stage performance of To Kill a Mockingbird was great. I was lucky enough to see that. And what I also thought was great is that they had contemporary writers, right, of today reflecting on different pieces of Hemingway's writing. Like, they would chronicle Hemingway's life, also talk about, different things that he wrote, during those time periods, and reference them with Jeff Daniels voicing it over. And then they would cut to a writer of today giving feedback on that same piece. And it was really interesting to see different writers from all different walks of life, Spanish writers, English writers from different countries, just opining on Hemingway's work and how they all had just like different perspectives on what things meant and how he wrote. And there was like a little piece where it was one of the writers' like favorite Hemingway piece ever. And that same piece to another writer was their least favorite. And I can appreciate that distinction because I think it's important for all of us to remember that there's always going to be people that love your stuff, people that hate your stuff, and a bunch of people in between. Like I always speak about there being a spectrum, like within everything, like within, people and how they do their jobs. It's a spectrum, people that do it well, people that do it poorly, etc. Like there's a spectrum within that as well, within how folks receive your work. And I think I touched on this during the last free writing session episode that I recorded, episode 179, where one of the writers during this, like reflecting on a Hemingway piece, states that I think he was sent out to Italy or France. I think Italy. And he saw a battle there because, he was part of the Red Cross and they would go try to help and aid the soldiers. He actually went through a situation where a few feet away from him, an enemy shell, I'm not sure what the technical term is, but a fucking bomb blew up somebody that was like a few feet away from him. And the shrapnel from it like cut him up like badly, like on his head, on his leg, to the point that he had to be hospitalized for like a couple months before being able to get shipped back home. And during this time period, he met a woman, a nurse that was American as well, and had a relationship with her. And she was like engaged to be married. And he was like head over heels in love, went back home, talked her up to the family and stuff like that, still stayed in touch with her. And then she pretty much like wrote him a letter, broke it off, and said that, she's going to get married to who she plans to get married with. And that he's kind of like too young for her. She was like 6, 7, 8 years older than him at the time. But that's like the first glimpse you get to him being like this hopeless romantic. And he was married 4 times throughout his life. And it's almost like each time he had one wife, would meet another woman. Sometimes the woman would like interact with his wife. Like it would be like a friend that would come over and he would wind up starting a relationship with them. And he would start a new relationship before being like separated and divorced from his current wife. I mean, he seemed to do that like each time. He had 3 children, if I'm not mistaken, one of which that is still alive and older now. I think he's like in his 70s. He was part of the documentary as well, and they asked him, questions about his father growing up and stuff like that. And he spoke about how like cool it was to, there were like 2 modes to him before. And again, this goes back to having a process when it comes to writing. Hemingway used to like wake up in the morning and write until like noontime or something like that. And before that time, like nobody could speak to him, look at him, like that was a sacred writing time. The son was reflecting on that and saying like it was cool but weird at the same time, that it's like you couldn't talk to dad before 12, but after 12 he was all yours, like more so than any other dad was with their, his friends' dads, like with their children, because he would like play games with them and elaborate games with them and just play with them all day, every day after 12. He seemed to battle with depression as well. Like it referenced like times where he was like just dark times, feeling like down and out. And some of his writing like reflected that as well. His father dealt with depression and actually committed suicide, which obviously I didn't know before watching this documentary. And he kind of resented his father for that until he got older and started dealing like with his own demons, and then finally understood like what it was that drove his father to do that. He was very much into like I don't know if calling it party scene would be using the right terminology, but definitely the way they depicted his lifestyle was like the gregarious, always going out to dinner with friends and for drinks and bars and hanging out type of guy. And going back to the adventure seeking, he was really into bullfighting. He wrote about it a lot. And quick aside, I didn't know bullfighting was what it was. I thought it was just like taunting like the bull and stuff with like the red cape the matadors use and just like fucking with them. But I didn't know they literally killed the bull each time. Like part of like that matador waving the red cape thing and making the bull charge at you is because when they do, they like stab them on top of like right behind the head or the neck or whatever you call that region in the bull. You know, by the end of it, he has like a bunch of these like swords, I guess. I don't know like the exact terminology for it, but like these swords sticking out of him, the bull, until he eventually collapses. But anyway, he was into that. He lived in Spain for a long time. He lived in France for a long time. He lived in Cuba. He had an estate in Cuba, I think, for like 10 or 20 years. He had like in between his writing and like his successes with writing, you know, his short stories and novels and nonfiction, he had like correspondence jobs and would go like overseas, like when World War II broke out, for example, and he would like write about the war. He would go hunting a lot. He'd go fishing a lot. He was like very outdoorsy like that. And something else that I found really interesting is how like some of the women writers that they interviewed, again, to reflect on some of his writing, wrote about how well he wrote within a woman's voice. And something he did, which I don't know if it's related or not, but they definitely drew like parallels to, is how he kind of like in his personal like sexual relationships, like with his wives, for example, he would do like a lot of role playing, and they had accounts of like him pretending to be the woman and them pretending to be the guy, and how his wives would like cut their hair like really short to match his, and that's like something that he wanted. So he was like very interesting and like layered at like every turn. F. Scott Fitzgerald, for example, the writer of The Great Gatsby, is the person that helped him get out of like some bullshit writing contract that he was in, and convinced him just write something like really shitty so your publisher drops you and then you can go sign with like my publisher. So that was like an interesting story of like, you know, two amazing writers in their day. And what was dope to see is that he used to shit on a lot of writers. Call it, you know, him being real, him being jealous, him being, you know, kind of like crabs in a bucket type of mentality. Maybe even kind of, there was a piece of the story that stated that it was known that like J.D. Salinger told him, like gave him tips on one of his first books that popped, and told him to like cut the first two chapters and started like at the third. He never gave F. Scott Fitzgerald, rather, he never gave him credit for that. And he said that wasn't true, that was always like his idea anyway. And I found it interesting that during one of his, you know, writing about war stints, there was a young soldier that, you know, knew he was nearby and like went to him and like took him some of his writing that he had been working on. And Ernest Hemingway gave him like positive feedback and positive results and told him that his writing was really good, etc., which was kind of contrary to how we saw him interacting with other writers up until that point. And that soldier was J.D. Salinger, who wrote The Catcher in the Rye, which, fun fact, was one of my favorite books in like my early 20s, I want to say. And full disclosure, it was like one of the only books that I read cover to cover around that time period. But I did like reread it like once or twice after that, and it's definitely a great read, which I've been meaning to revisit. But anyway, how dope is that? You know, like I've spoken about how like encouraging it would be to like get feedback from, you know, somebody that you like admire or look up to and stuff like that. And comics speak about this a lot, like when they're coming up in comedy, and how like a headliner tells them, oh, that was a good joke, that kind of like motivates them to like keep grinding and keep going for like another year or two, you know what I mean? And it's like, who knows if like Hemingway was shitty to him in that point, if we would have even had Catcher in the Rye today, you know what I mean? Just like words can encourage, words can discourage too. I myself have, you know, gotten encouragement just from what I know from the other side, was probably just like a fleeting moment that they definitely never would remember again. But like Ernest Cline, writer of Ready Player One and Ready Player Two, liked one of my tweets once, and I was like on cloud nine. writer and podcaster Daniele Bolelli. I emailed him and asked for some writing advice, which he gave me. Same with Graham Hancock, and things like that kind of give you like some extra wind in your sails that even now, like looking back, help me. You know what I mean? So I thought that was a pretty dope factoid that I got from the documentary. But yeah, I definitely recommend it. I know it's a very large undertaking. It's 2 hours each part, and there's 3 parts, so it's a total of 6 hours. But obviously, you don't have to see it all in one sitting. Break it up. But if you're into writing, definitely check it out. If you want to learn more about Hemingway, which was my case, definitely check it out. And if you just want to hear like a very interesting story, definitely check it out. There was towards the end, and he used to like drink a lot and stuff like that. That was actually an issue that he battled with throughout his life. But he went through so much shit during one of his like hunting retreats. He got like some sort of parasite that he like almost died from, and he had to get like airlifted out from where he was hunting. And when he was airlifted, I think either the helicopter or the plane crashed, and he actually survived that as well. And it's nuts. It's just like chock full of interesting stories, and you get some real insight into who Ernest Hemingway was and how really tight his writing was. Like, he has like an economy of words to the fullest. And by that, I mean, saying less or as little as possible, but still conveying as much as possible at the same time, which is definitely no small feat. Another unrelated thing that I remember about Hemingway, not from this documentary, but just in general, is, and I could be misremembering this because this is strictly from memory, I didn't like fact check myself, but I want to say in the movie City of Angels, is that the right name of the movie? It's the movie with Nicolas Cage and Meg Ryan where he's like an angel and she's a doctor, and they wind up like falling in love, and he winds up giving up being an angel or something like that. But in one scene that I remember always like resonated with me was him asking her to describe how, because angels don't have the ability to like feel and touch and taste and stuff like that, apparently, and him asking her to describe how a pear tastes, and she describes it as, or actually maybe it's him trying to describe it to her, I forget, or they're trying to like describe it to each other, but then they eventually land on, or whatever that scene lands on, one of them describing it as, taking a bite into the piece of fruit that's like cold at first and then sweet, and it's like a sugary sand on your tongue. And that was like a Hemingway quote, something like that. I don't know. I just thought that was dope anyway. And just thought I would share it. But yeah, definitely check it out. It's called Hemingway. It's a documentary by Ken Burns.